what looks like a really wonderful series of lectures and discussions. I think, excuse me just one second. Okay, I've got it. I think the scope of what you've been covering in this series of conversations points to the fact that you are very serious about learning what nonviolence is. I think that the fact that you're doing this in many ways puts you ahead of so many other communities that either dismiss or adopt nonviolence without really digging in to understand what are the implications of a commitment to nonviolence. You've talked about Jesus' call to nonviolent discipleship and addressed very specific examples. I understand a number of them having to do with domestic violence and gender violence and street violence. But as we just heard, soon to be connecting to the death penalty. I love the fact that so it looks like you did a retreat on using the alternatives to violence methodology, which is quite wonderful. So you're already in many ways light years ahead of so many people who have a very narrow and very incomplete understanding of both violence and nonviolence. On the one hand, it seems to me that it's really important to recognize violence in its multiple manifestations. Direct physical violence is certainly one form of violence, but structural, systemic, and cultural violence are equally important. So racism is a virulent expression of violence. Oppression is violence. Economic injustice is violence. Environmental destruction is violence. Apartheid is violence. The list is very, very long. So let me see if we can do the technology here to share a screen so I can share a few pictures with you. Okay. I was invited specifically this morning to share with you a little bit about the recent movement of the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence and the efforts of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative to help the church move in that direction. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is a project of Pax Christi International that began with a few very basic questions. What if the 1.3 or so billion Catholics in the world had a full understanding of the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence and the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel? What if we all knew how to apply nonviolent tools to diffuse conflict before it became violent? What if the Catholic Church committed its channels of communication and diplomacy, its vast spiritual, intellectual, and financial resources to promoting active nonviolence? What if Catholic schools, colleges, universities, and seminaries integrated programs on nonviolence and just peace into their curricula, their research, and their community outreach efforts? These questions and other ones similar were discussed at a small conference on nonviolence and just peace that was held in Rome in 2016. Co-sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, the precursor to what is now the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, and Pax Christi International. The fact that we co-sponsored a conference as Pax Christi International with the Vatican was in itself pretty groundbreaking. Among the 80 participants at that conference now almost 6 years ago were many people living in contexts of violence and war. They were from Iraq and Afghanistan, from Palestine and Uganda, from South Sudan and Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and a number of other countries. Many participants, including from the Philippines, had deep experience with effective nonviolence under extremely challenging circumstances. I mention in particular the Philippines because of the long struggle in the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao to apply nonviolent strategies to reach a conclusion that is just and peaceful. One participant in the 2016 conference, Iraqi sister Nazik Mati, whose community was expelled from Mosul in northern Iraq by ISIS, said, "War is the mother of ignorance, isolation, and poverty. Please tell the world there is no such thing as a just war. I say this," she said, "as a daughter of war. We can't respond to violence with more violence." A Jesuit from Colombia, Father Francisco de Rue, also who was a participant in the conference, talked about the use of the just war paradigm in Colombia by all sides in that conflict, by the guerrillas, by the paramilitary groups, by the official army, to rationalize their participation in what became 50 long years of killing, kidnapping, and enormous destruction. The task of moving beyond that conflict has been an enormous one, although it's making progress. What they and others shared with us in those few days helped us to think much more deeply about the nature of violence and to begin to develop a deeper, more nuanced, and more complex understanding of nonviolence as well, as an approach that is actively working to stop repression and violence, but is also working to promote social justice, human dignity, and a healthy planet. I'm sure you already know well that nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a global ethic, and also a diverse set of proven effective tools for interrupting violence, for transforming conflict, for promoting social justice, and for working to promote the integrity of creation. In other words, nonviolence is not passive. It does not try to avoid conflict. It does try to promote social justice and to promote ecological integrity, working for more just and peaceful worlds. In first century Palestine, where direct and cultural violence were surely a way of life, think of the Roman occupation and of the ways in which purity laws and religious practices were excluding women and lepers and so on. Jesus proclaimed a new nonviolent way of life that was rooted in radical inclusion, the beloved community, the unconditional love of God. You've already spent time in this series reflecting on Jesus' call to nonviolent discipleship, so you know very well how Jesus taught his disciples to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, and when on the night before he died, he told Peter to put his sword away, Jesus marked out a path of nonviolence. He walked that path to the very end of his life, to the cross, where he took on evil, took on violence himself rather than inflicting violence on others, and overcame violence by his suffering and death. That's the fundamental belief in resurrection that in so many ways shapes our tradition, was in many ways a vindication of nonviolence over violence. Those of us who were gathered at the 2016 conference appealed to the church to further develop Catholic social teaching on nonviolence, to integrate gospel nonviolence into the life and the work of the church, to promote the development of nonviolent practices and strategies, to lift up the prophetic voices of peacemakers and nonviolent activists around the world, and to move the just war tradition further into the background of Catholic teaching. Following the conference in 2016, we specifically asked Pope Francis to write an encyclical on nonviolence. We're still hoping for that. So the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative grew out of that 2016 conference as a project of Pax Christi International. We were delighted when Pope Francis wrote his 2017 World Day of Peace message on Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. It was an interesting title that Pope Francis apparently chose himself. And in many ways, we've been in pretty continual dialogue with the Vatican since, especially with the dicastery for integral human development, but with other parts of the structures as well. I'm sure you've all read the 50th World Day of Peace message from 2017. If you haven't, I encourage you to do so. In it, Pope Francis offered a really significant reflection on the practical application, including in public policies, of nonviolent approaches to just or integral peace. He talked about nonviolence, both as a personal virtue rooted in human dignity and a political strategy with justice, and equity at the center. Nonviolence is powerful, he said, and potentially very effective, with roots in dialogue, respect, concern for the good of the other, in mercy, and in forgiveness. He said that an ethics of fraternity and peaceful coexistence between individuals and among peoples cannot be based on the logic of fear, violence, and closed-mindedness, but can be based on responsibility, respect, and sincere dialogue. He said peace building through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. In that same message, he offered a very specific challenge to political leaders, to the heads of international institutions, to business and media executives, calling on them to apply the Beatitudes in the exercise of their respective responsibilities. Very interesting. To show mercy, he said, by refusing to discard people or to harm the environment, or to seek to win at any cost. He called on them to choose solidarity as a way of making history and building fraternity, building friendship in society. Active nonviolence, he said, is a way of showing that unity is truly more powerful and more fruitful than conflict. Everything in the world is interconnected. He talks about that over and over again, doesn't he? He talks about integral ecology, integral human development, integral peace, and we hear echoes of that in Laudato Si and in Fratelli Tutti. Nonviolence as a style of politics for peace, again, those were Pope Francis' words, sides with those who are most impacted by the monumental violence and injustice of our time. Think of Afghanistan, of people trying to survive in Tigray in Ethiopia, of Syrians seeking refuge in Lebanon and Jordan, of Africans crossing the Mediterranean in flimsy boats trying to get to Europe, of Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans crossing the border, our southern border, into our own country. Nonviolence as a style of politics for peace should mobilize our communities, our nations, and our world to promote the things that we know make for peace: economic justice, human dignity, a flourishing planet, mutual respect, and a world free from every form of violence, whether physical, structural, or cultural. In asking the Church to adopt a new moral framework based on nonviolent practice for its teaching on nonviolence and war, we at that conference 6 years ago were in fact building on a tradition that was already moving in that direction and has moved even further since then. Given what we know about the consequences of horrific violence and war, the cost in human life, psychological trauma, moral injury, environmental damage, climate disruption, and on, and given the vast resources spent on preparations for war, resources that we've seen certainly in the last year and a half so clearly are needed for healthcare, for food security, for education. Given that that reality that we've seen play out now for decades, the official Church has repeatedly insisted that just war is practically impossible and has called for an end to war as a human institution. You know this, but I think it's good to remember it, that as far in the past as Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris, during the Second Vatican Council a few years later in Gaudium et Spes, in Pope Paul VI's words at the United Nations, Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, all repeated that plea. But the just war tradition has remained central to Catholic teaching on war and peace, and nations, particularly our own, have continued to spend vast fortunes. I think the proposal right now for next year is that we would spend $775 billion on preparing for war and on weapons. And we've continued to spend almost nothing on nonviolence or on preparing nonviolent alternatives to the use of violent force. I think Maslow was right. If the only tool that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There are so many examples of that we can talk about. What we need, we think, are more fully developed, fully nonviolent tools and for nonviolent approaches to dealing with conflict, and strong incentive to use them as well as to develop them. Finally, in Fratelli Tutti last fall, Pope Francis explicitly moved the just war tradition off center stage in Catholic teaching. It was a really huge step we think, in the right direction. And it was a bit of a surprise. If you've not read Fratelli Tutti really carefully, I encourage you to do so and pay particular attention to the footnotes in the section on the just war tradition. There are just a few sentences there, but they are a very significant move on the part of Pope Francis to not to reject the just war tradition as something that was never useful, but to move it off center stage based on the belief that a just war is simply impossible, and that experience tells us that that tradition has very often been used as an excuse to continue preparing for war and at times to go for war. So do look at Fratelli Tutti closely if you've not already. At the same time, it is really important to be clear that we are not calling for passivity, but for a paradigm shift to clear, muscular, nonviolent strategies for interrupting violence and for preventing violence where it's possible to do that, as well as for protecting vulnerable people. Our belief is that we have so developed our capacity to use violence, whether it's locally or nationally or internationally, that we tend to move in that direction very quickly, and that a serious investment in developing nonviolent tools will enable us to choose a different paradigm much more readily. We also recognize that ethical norms to guide political decisions and decision makers in a world that remains violent will still be necessary. Many such norms are already very well ensconced in, for example, international humanitarian law, and would be included in shaping a new moral framework to replace the just war tradition, but that would be focused on nonviolent approaches. In fact, I believe that any use of force, including, for example, sanctions or nonviolent civil resistance, which are often can be nonviolent, need to be subjected to the kind of rigorous ethical evaluation that even a thought about moving to war would need. Nonviolence is not simple, and it's not necessarily always safe. Think of the resistors in Myanmar and the challenges that they've been facing. Those committed to nonviolence often do risk injury or death, even when their actions are non-confrontational, think about environmental activists throughout the world who are some of the most frequently killed or threatened activists, and whose work is very often not confrontational, but it is challenging the status quo. A nonviolent struggle for just peace might take years, and the path of nonviolence toward just peace will be far from linear. But evidence does suggest that the outcome will be more sustainable and just if transformation can be achieved using nonviolent means rather than violence. Nonviolence, just to sort of stretch our thinking about it a little bit, can be public demonstrations. We know that. Hopefully they're well planned. But it also can be a myriad of other, not always visible resistance actions, such as staying home, music and art, and so on. I'm sure you know about Gene Sharp's 198 methods of nonviolent action, but Michael Beer, who's the director at Nonviolence International, has very recently published a wonderful book called Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century that explores the expanding universe of nonviolent tactics, including the use of new technologies, social media, and so on. I love the sort of exercise of thinking about what do we mean by nonviolent action? And this is in addition to recognizing that nonviolence is a spirituality and a way of life. But when you sort of move into the public arena, what are the kinds of actions that we're talking about? And I love this story, some of you may know, from Mali in West Africa. Someone recently was describing a traditional practice in Mali where when there is a serious conflict in a local community, one person in the community is charged with being a jester almost, and dressing up in a kind of wild outfit and jumping into the middle of the conflict to try to make people laugh and move beyond the sort of intransigence of a conflict. There are so many creative ways. I'm sure you saw examples in Germany and Austria in the last few years as the far right groups were gathering and marching through towns, that there was a contest of local citizens to identify which part of those protests were the most ridiculous, and in order to just highlight the challenge of how do we get at dealing with very challenging and sophisticated expressions of violence, even as they just begin to move along. We think that those of us who live in relatively safe spaces, who are attempting to understand what the gospel of nonviolence would mean in our own times, that we need to listen very carefully to people who are living in very violent contexts and who are trying to implement nonviolent strategies. So, for example, a year or so ago, I spent a few weeks in El Salvador interviewing about 20 people in that country who had been involved in one way or another in support of the guerrilla struggle for liberation and an end to repression in El Salvador. And I went to listen very carefully to their experience of believing that violence was a route to liberation, a way to end repression, and what it looks like to them now, 20 or 25 years later. We interviewed women and men, young and not so young, politicians, pastoral workers, professors, a sociologist, priests, a former guerrilla leader, women religious, a former magistrate of the Salvadoran Supreme Court, former minister of the economy, a scripture scholar, members of Christian-based communities, and theologians. Every person we met was deeply affected by violence. They had been affected by the repression for years. They were affected by the Civil War, and they have been deeply affected by gang violence. Their horrific experiences of structural violence and of war challenged us and our questions about the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence. I was really listening carefully to whether what we were believing about the potential for nonviolence was completely unrealistic in a setting like that in El Salvador. Most of the people we interviewed are actively building just peace now. Their way of life and engagement in very different nonviolent ways of building the beloved community with, as John Sobrino said, the poor and the marginalized at the center, confirmed our belief that ultimately active nonviolence may be the only way to build a culture of just peace. And they agreed with us. The possibilities described on a webinar that I watched the other day gave me real hope that even in Afghanistan, it is possible to imagine nonviolent ways to organize resistance to the Taliban and an approach to a dignified life. We can talk about that a little bit more later if you want. In our times, there are so many faces of violence. Thomas Merton wrote years ago, the problem of violence is not the problem of a few rioters and rebels, excuse me, but the problem of a whole structure which is outwardly ordered and respectable, but inwardly ridden by psychopathic obsessions and delusions. Pope Francis has said simple things. He talks about polite violence, that we need to be careful that we don't perpetuate polite violence. It was really encouraging then to read Pope Francis' really monumental words in the World Day of Peace message. One step that he has taken, you'll be hearing more about in your next session, was his absolute opposition to the death penalty. It was a real claim on nonviolence, even changing the catechism to reflect new Catholic teaching that rules out any excuse for the application of capital punishment. Another was his final rejection of the right to nuclear deterrence as an interim step toward nuclear disarmament. Years ago, Father Dick McSorley, a Jesuit working at Georgetown University, talked about nuclear weapons as the taproot of our violence, that as long as we were willing to hold on to nuclear weapons, we left open the door to all kinds of other violences. But at a conference on nuclear disarmament organized by the Vatican in November of 2017, Pope Francis called the very possession of nuclear weapons morally indefensible. And the Vatican very strongly supported the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. During that same conference on nuclear disarmament, Bishop McElroy from San Diego made my heart sing. Excuse me, I need to move forward here a little bit. Made my heart sing when he said the church is in the midst of a fundamental reappraisal of how to balance the Christian obligation to nonviolence with the need to resist violence and evil in the world. The traditional norms of just war, particularly in the jus ad bellum, increasingly appear to us, he said, to be incapable of effectively constraining violence in the modern world. The power of nonviolence, once relegated to the category of romantic idealism, has emerged as a potent force for social transformation and the building of lasting peace. Bishop McElroy continued, the church must be a voice in the world constantly pointing humanity toward the path of nonviolence and the logic of peace. This radically positive approach demands that we change the default position in our reasoning about war from acquiescence in the patterns and structures of violence to an active and persistent engagement with strategies of peace. Amazing. During the 2017 and 2018, 5 virtual Catholic Nonviolence Initiative roundtables engaged theologians and peace practitioners and local activists from around the world in a regular, it was about monthly, series of reflections to further develop the different aspects of nonviolence. There were 5 groups of about 10 to 15 people each, and there was one group on each topic. One focused on developing a foundational theology of nonviolence. A second focused on what are the biblical foundations of Jesus' nonviolence. A third on articulating a new moral framework to replace the just war thinking that would be based on nonviolence and emphasizing just peace. A fourth brought together very specific, very interesting and well-developed examples of how Catholic communities in different parts of the world have applied nonviolence in very different situations to move toward a more just peace. And the fifth were specific proposals for how the church might integrate nonviolence into sort of every corner of the life of the church. The results of these roundtable conversations form the basis of a second conference co-sponsored by the Dicastery for Integral Human Development and Pax Christi International that took place in Rome also in the spring of 2019. It was entitled The Path of Nonviolence Toward a Culture of Peace, and again brought about 80 people together, this time with more a higher representation of Catholic hierarchy from different parts of the world to continue the conversation about nonviolence. Roundtables also resulted in the publication of a book by Pax Christi International called Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace in the Church and the World. Since then, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Pax Christi's project, has been in very regular dialogue with the Vatican, both directly and by contributing to a number of different Vatican-sponsored conferences on nuclear disarmament, on cybersecurity, on the anniversary of Caritas and Veritate, and so on. And by preparing a retreat for the dicastery last Christmas on gospel nonviolence that was a very interesting project and brought about 700 people from around the world into prayer together for a day of reflection on nonviolence. We've been very actively involved in the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission, particularly in the security task force, but also we've been contributing to the Laudato Si action platform, which you've, I'm sure, heard a great deal about, making clear the essential contribution and connection of nonviolence to the kind of future that's envisioned in that beautiful, really spectacular vision of Laudato Si. We produced a small resource that took each of the Laudato Si goals and connected those to an expression of violence and how demonstrated how nonviolent action could be an appropriate response. We've also been in pretty ongoing conversation with local churches, often through religious congregations, through a number of bishops from Japan, the Middle East, Germany, Canada, Italy, Peru, the US, and through several international Catholic organizations like Caritas, CRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, and others. Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is also trying to listen very carefully to people from different contexts, because we believe that nonviolence in the context, for example, of occupation in Palestine, or nonviolence in the context of poverty or street violence or gang violence in Haiti, nonviolence from the perspective of different countries in Latin America, nonviolence in Eastern Europe facing an uncertain future, nonviolence intersecting with cultural and structural racism in the United States, nonviolence in post-colonial Africa, nonviolence in Myanmar following the military coup, and on and on and on, will look very different. That in many ways, nonviolence has to be contextually appropriate, both for it to be effective and for it to attract large numbers of people. Especially gratifying in the last couple of years has been the response of a number of Catholic, of religious communities, of universities, and some of our partners that have sponsored conferences and workshops and symposia, have added nonviolence specifically to peace studies curricula, and have begun to identify, for example, research topics that could contribute in a very specific way to the kind of evidence base that is going to be necessary for applying active nonviolence in a variety of political contexts. We've also developed a number of contacts and resources to engage local communities, schools, and parishes in learning more about creatively promoting nonviolence in their own particular situation. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is not replicating the work of many other organizations that have developed fabulous resources on nonviolence, including, for example, the Pace Bene, the Meta Center on Nonviolence, the Beatitudes Center, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, Nonviolence International, the Meta Peace Team or the DC Peace Team, and so many others. What we're trying to do is to connect people with all of those resources. Just this last year, we also initiated the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action between September 21st and October 2nd, and we hope to repeat that each year in a particular way to engage local parishes like your own, local and national and international partners in thinking about nonviolence in exactly the way that you have all been doing, and to help promote familiarity with nonviolence in all of its different expressions. We are specifically connecting the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action with Days of Creation, which are just at the same time of year, and with Campaign Nonviolence, which has been collecting examples of nonviolent action over several years. The obstacles are huge. There was one other example that I wanted to share with you because it was just published this week. That slide is a little odd, sorry. We just published this week in a webinar on Thursday, a tool, policymakers' tool for applying or establishing public policy that would support nonviolent alternatives in challenging situations. Sorry, that slide wasn't very clear. What we did is we published a booklet. It's maybe 30 pages long that both explains what we mean by just peace. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? How do we bring together justice and peace? And with it talks about nonviolence in a general way, but most particularly lifts up a number of specific examples, both at an international level, at a national level, and then also at a local level, of ways in which policymakers have passed laws or established policies that actually encouraged the use of nonviolent alternatives. We think that this is a really important step, and it's not an easy one to grasp because we're not talking about examples of nonviolence, but examples of policies that would support nonviolence. So what we know is that the obstacles are huge, including powerful forces behind the very big business of making weapons and war. But we believe very deeply that we can live our way into the challenge by nurturing a spirituality of nonviolence, by learning to communicate nonviolently, even when we very strongly disagree with each other, by working for a just peace wherever we're planted, and by advocating for nonviolent ways to conduct our public affairs in a broken world. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of where the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been trying to move, how we've been pushing the Catholic Church institutionally, and some of the success that I think we're beginning to see. I am enormously heartened. I think 6 years ago, if you had asked me that Pope Francis would actually take a step to move the just war tradition and all that it implies to a secondary place in Catholic teaching, I probably wouldn't have believed it. Or that we would have heard as many people in as many places grappling with, what do we mean by nonviolence? Is it practical? Are we being naive by thinking that nonviolent tools could, in fact, move us toward a more just and peaceful world? I'm very heartened by the project, by the progress we've made, and hope we can have a little bit of time now to talk about it and answer your questions or hear your comments. Thank you. So I am very open to your questions. I think there have been some comments in the chat that I haven't seen. I don't know if, John, if you want to look at the questions and, sort of lead us through this, or others are ready to just ask questions directly, it's up to you.
Sure, thank you. Got two devices running at once. Let's open it up first to folks who are here in person. Any questions or comments you'd like to make? Carol.
About self-defense, writ large in the world, you might have some people coming in and stealing women and beating up children, and you've got to do something about it.
Absolutely. I totally agree. There is nothing, in fact, what we believe is that there will not be magic answers or magic solutions, that we are still obligated to work for peace and to protect people who are at risk, to prevent violence. But essentially, we believe that with practice, with a significant investment in developing nonviolent approaches to dealing with the kinds of potentially very violent situations that you referred to, that we will be much more successful at interrupting violence, and that it really does reflect a belief that, on the one hand, there already are many tools for dealing with violences of human trafficking, or violences of domestic abuse, violences of street violence I live in Washington, D.C., which is having a really difficult time with gun violence right now, and all the way to war, that anticipating and committing in the long run to taking the steps toward preventing violence will go a long way. There's not one magic answer for everything. It's I think, a commitment to look for nonviolent solutions and to increase their capacity before we come to a place where we're encountering violence. In much the same way we invest now in preparing for war. We train, we learn about how to go to war, we build the weapons, we invest in them. We need to do exactly the same thing for nonviolent approaches, of which there are many. So yeah, never saying it's easy, never saying it's quick, certainly not saying we can ignore situations in which, especially where people are at risk, but that we need to find new ways to deal with them. And there are lots of examples. One that comes to my mind immediately, I use the example of people at risk in South Sudan or Iraq or Tigray, in addition to in our own country. Efforts like Nonviolent Peace Force have been tremendously successful at helping local communities build their own capacity to resist really terrible violence. So that's a quick answer, but I'd be glad to say more if you're interested.
Others, either here in the room or those of you who are joining us virtually?
What were some of the things that happened during the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action this year, and what's planned for the future?
This year, there were the connection this year was very specifically made between nonviolence and the Laudato Si realization of actions related to Laudato Si. So in many places there were webinars or parish workshops and so on, where local communities or religious congregations were developing their own Laudato Si action plan. People very specifically were connecting nonviolent actions to some of the steps that they were taking. I think it was it was probably mostly those sorts of actions this year. In the future, we will be developing our own capacity to make connections between parishes and dioceses from one part of the world to the next, so that we all recognize that what we're doing in that week is connecting to the actions of many other people, communities. One just differential is that in many places, nonviolent action is understood to be synonymous with a public demonstration. And that's totally fine. That's what some communities do when they think about nonviolent action. But in many other places, it might be exactly what you've been doing in hosting a series of conversations, discussions on nonviolence, hosting a debate we had a wonderful conversation at San Diego University a while ago that the university set up between people active in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and the ethicists from the military academies across the United States. It was a wonderful conversation because there is a deep commitment to peace from both perspectives, but we had a lot of talking to do about how do we find a way to achieve a just peace without the use of violent force. So lots of different ways to go, and hopefully we'll build in the coming years. On the Pax Christi International website, there is a page dedicated to the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. It's www.nonviolencejustpeace.net, and there's a connection to different actions during the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action there. Another that I just thought of was in the West Bank, in Bethlehem and other parts of the West Bank in Palestine. There were public actions by youth and women to just demonstrate their commitment to nonviolence and to an end to the occupation. It's very interesting. So lots of examples. Maybe one more. How are we doing on the time here? Another common action during the Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action in many communities was to reflect on, and for those who felt called to do so, to make a vow of nonviolence, which has been very much a part of Pax Christi's life, particularly in the United States, but around the world for many, many years. And I am personally finding it to be a wonderful tool for reflection on what we mean by violence and nonviolence.
Had support, is that okay? Yeah. Have you had support from the USCCB on these efforts, either in general or from individual bishops around the country?
We've had some support. What I actually, shortly after our first conference, I was asked to speak to the USCCB International Committee, and did have an opportunity to share with the committee what we're trying to accomplish. We've had some conversations about very specific actions, but more support from individual bishops in the United States. And I have to say, even more from bishops around the world. We've been doing a series of Zoom conversations every few months with bishops from different parts of the world, mostly to listen to their local experience. Bishop McElroy has faithfully participated in those from San Diego, and many others. Bishop Stowe, who's the bishop of president of Pax Christi USA, and a number of others have been involved. But we've had a wonderful response, for example, from the current patriarch of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Cyprus, Patriarch Isabella, from a Japanese bishop, from bishops in Europe. And what we're doing is encouraging them to think together about what violence looks like in their context and what nonviolent actions they can encourage, or how they might prepare people in their diocese to be ready to use nonviolent actions in the future. There's a wonderful archbishop in Fiji who maybe 2 years ago now, in the context of a threatened coup, very strongly called for a nonviolent action and was successful in bridging what could have been a very dangerous situation to something that was more remedied without violence. So it's very interesting. It's uneven. What we're finding is that the church internationally is very big, with lots of different approaches to life and lots of different contexts. But we're very hopeful that there's a conversation underway that is challenging all of us who are looking at a world that seems unable to break out of one episode of violence after another, that maybe it's possible to move to a new paradigm, excuse me, that would be defined by nonviolence.
Do you have a sense of younger generations of Catholics in the United States, of any kind of commitment to nonviolence as a way of living out Catholicism? I know it's in other traditions and in non-religious traditions, plenty of young people are turning to it, but do you have a sense that within our own ecclesial circles, young people are seeing the viability of this?
I don't I don't know that I could say yes definitively, but what I have seen, most particularly in Pax Christi, in circles gathered by Pax Christi USA, I see great hope and many young people who are wrestling with some of these questions. Part of what we're trying to do is to encourage the institutional church to kind of set the context for a conversation that then will have to take place by each of us wherever we are. And we're certainly hoping because we're making a pretty strong connection between violence against the earth and the need to address climate change and biodiversity loss and so on. We hope that young people who are very engaged in the Laudato Si movement will see the connections and articulate them in a way. Sometimes I think we move toward nonviolent options, but we don't say that. And so we leave nonviolence as a word or a way of being kind of on the shelf as something that's naive or too idealistic or unrealistic, when in fact our lives are mostly nonviolent. And we mostly find nonviolent ways to deal with even very difficult situations. So we're encouraging people to use the language of nonviolence, to be comfortable with it, to explore what would it look like in this situation? What am I already doing? What am I seeing in my neighborhood that is already an inspiring and effective nonviolent ways of dealing with conflict? There are lots of wonderful examples.
As a follow-up to John's question, anything being done on college campuses, maybe particularly Catholic colleges?
Yes, there is actually. There are a couple of, there's probably even more than I know about, but what I know about is the piece that the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been particularly connected to. We have had both in the US and internationally pretty active ongoing conversations, mostly at the level of professors in Catholic universities and some administrative personnel in Catholic universities who are looking for ways to incorporate nonviolence into the university context. For one obvious way is by having conferences and holding seminars and webinars on related topics, but also a number are looking at using our book on advancing nonviolence in some of their classes. Some are looking for ways to particularly integrate a focus on nonviolence into peace studies classes. So in reality, some peace studies curricula don't ever look at nonviolence in a very specific way. So we're trying to lift that up. Another I think it will be increasingly interesting is, as we've seen over the last 10 years, maybe less, nonviolent strategies, there has been increasing research done that demonstrates that in some circumstances, nonviolent strategies are significantly more effective than violence. You know, you can see it, but it's been shown with pretty broad studies. What we're hoping to do is to encourage graduate students and undergraduates, anybody interested, to identify research topics so that their research would contribute in a specific way to the kind of evidence that especially political decision makers are looking for before they're willing to move in the direction of a nonviolent option. So, for example, the work that Nonviolent Peace Force has been doing around the world, which has been quite spectacular in many different very violent situations, is now building a body of evidence that demonstrates when it would be effective to introduce such a a nonviolent peace force. Under what circumstances it's likely to be effective and so on. That kind of research, we hope will be being done by Catholic universities around the world. And we're hopeful. And there are at least some that are thinking about it very seriously. So yeah, hopefully we'll see more action on Catholic university campuses in the coming years. But it's a long-term project.
Thank you so much, Marie. I know we're at time and I want to give folks over here a chance to get to the liturgy. But I want to echo Janice Vanderhaar says in the chat, and I want to read her words because I think they express all of our sentiments. You lift my spirits, Marie. Thank you for bringing together a positive message to those of us in this for the long haul.
Yeah.
We are integrally bonded in our commitment to continue our belief that gospel nonviolence is so important in this world of violence. Peace be with you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Well, it was a pleasure to be with you, and feels like we kind of barreled through a lot in a short time, but thank you for the ongoing work that you're doing. It is really important. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. And for those of you, keep an eye on the chat. I posted links to the various resources, many of them at least, mentioned in this, and I will include more of the resources mentioned in this talk on our website if you're interested in following up. And we'll also follow up 2 Sundays from now on some of these.
Thanks again.
Peace and love.